This is Sirens, a new but actually not terribly new series brought to you by the ladies of Bombshell, where we dissect the institutions of American power. Join us as we sound the alarm in technology, governance, and national security, and maybe lure some men to their deaths. I'm Lauren DeYoung-Shulman.
I'm Rada Plow.
And we are here with Dr. Mara Karlin, who we are enormous fans of here in the Sirens Bombshell Extended Universe. She is currently a professor at SICE at Johns Hopkins, a visiting scholar at Brookings, a former strategy guru at the Department of Defense, and just an all-around amazing person. And we are actually doing something different this week. We're bringing her into the question of the week, and it's a drill in addition to our warning signs interview. So I'm going to start off by picking on Rada and then go to Mara of if you could delete one buzzword from current use, what would it be? Rada.
Anything that starts with the word agentic. I'm using air quotes. You can't see it, but I live my world with people believing that agentic solutions are going to fix all of the things with all of their AI magic. They're not, friends. They're not. They can do some things, but they're not the magical solution to agentic procurement, agentic enterprises, agentic blah blahs.
I feel like agentic is like something we just started using as you thought you were starting to understand AI, but let me throw agentic into it. And probably you don't yet. You should. Mara, what about you?
I would like to delete the word requirement.
Oh, okay.
So when you do like defense budgeting and strategic planning in the Pentagon, there's this whole effort involving requirements. But the thing is, it assumes that you know what you actually need and that it is exactly the answer to what you need. And so it's always driven me nutty that folks will say my requirement is this or the requirements process. Whereas there's like a number of different ways you might be able to meet the need, and you got to try to figure out what those, how you might best do that.
Desires. We should try to throw in desires into the defense budget and acquisition planning and see how that goes.
Absolutely.
Desires. Okay, mine is, I actually don't even know. I think there's different ways to pronounce it, either kludge or kludge, like sludge. And this is like what people have started to call all of the bureaucratic, regulatory mishmash of process that slows things down. This is just kludge or kludge. And like, yes, that does exist. Don't get me wrong. It absolutely does. But I feel like we've now hit when things are slow and that annoys me, then that is the fault of kludge or kludge, as opposed to actually some things are slow on purpose, as opposed to some things are fast on purpose. So I would like people to, like, before they are allowed to throw that around, to like talk about, okay, so what would you delete from that? It's okay if you have deletions, but like, what would you actually delete, as opposed to just being like, blah, I don't like it. It's slow. Speaking of things that I don't like and are slow, it is only 3:00 on, it's like Tuesday, which means I'm no closer to the cocktail parties and happy hours that I should be. So I'll start with Isabel here as I drink tea instead, where we are talking through what are some of the gossipy cocktail hour nerdy issues that may be coming up on the DC circuit right now. And I'm actually really excited. Going to start with the food pyramid, Rada, because like this definitely caught my eye before, and I'm so excited to get to be able to chat about this briefly. Rada, food pyramid.
So, like, big picture, the Trump administration released new dietary guidelines with the food pyramid being replaced by a food rectangle / upside down pyramid.
Pizza?
At the top of it, which just goes to the whole graphic design problem, but let me table that for a minute. At the top of it is protein, dairy, and healthy fats. So basically, this is a big change in how much Americans should eat things like meat, or are recommended to eat things like meat. And the protein recommendations specifically increased dramatically to being like 1 to 2 times what was previously recommended, which I guess aligns to my Instagram feed, but otherwise seems like an interesting choice. I think a lot of nutrition experts think that the information was more ideological than substantive. and it is, it's not necessarily great, though it did call out ultra processed foods and added sugar. So I guess that's a silver lining here. But also, just if you're going to change the food pyramid, my dudes, get some cool graphic designers and make it really razzle dazzle.
Okay, so Rada, you probably don't know this, but they had the National Design Studio, which is supposed to be like the new hotness at the White House, design this. And guys, like, so the 2000s want their web design back because they use continuous scroll, like one of the longest continuous scrolls I've ever seen that wasn't like a news story, in order to portray the food pyramid. And look, I just have this really strong feeling that when government is offering information as a service should be a thing. It should be like, what is the best way I can get this to people, as opposed to, let me put a whole bunch of like animated broccoli on a screen and call it a day. My favorite comment on this, I don't subscribe to this per se, but my favorite was, it reminds them of the animated fruit videos you can find on YouTube to entertain babies. And it's like, that is so true. It's just not the most beautiful design I've ever seen in the whole world. I wish the National Design Studio luck in their future endeavors.
Being from Wisconsin, I'll say any food pyramid that tells me I'm supposed to eat more cheese is a great thing. I'm just a little confused as to how that will be better for me.
Well, the people who would normally tell you it would be better for you, they may not actually work for the federal government or not, because we just got a new, really awesome, fascinating batch of federal workforce data being released. Let's start with the awesomeness here. So previously, federal workforce data was called FedScope, and it used a thing called a data cube. And I'm not even going to try to explain that on live podcasting time. But it was like from the 90s at best. It was so bad, so hard to work with. Like, people who have been in this business for ages didn't understand it. The new data.opm.gov, there's lots of different ways to access this new data release. They did an amazing job on this. So congrats to OPM on it. We did learn some amazing things in this, though. It's like the federal government lost 300,000 plus jobs last year, which is somewhat atypical. It only hired a little over 68K jobs. Typically, the federal government does about 200K hires per year. Several agencies lost more than a quarter of their staff, including places like education, ag, and HUD. And there are other facets of the data that are no longer available, like race and ethnicity. So this is a really great data set to pull into to learn more about what we know about the federal workforce and the changes. It is a little outdated and slow, and you'll see this when you go in. Some data doesn't catch up to real time overall. But it is both a catch-22 of OPM doing an amazing job making this more accessible, while also having a story to tell that is deeply concerning to those of us who care about government capacity. Rada, did you have any others besides the food pyramid?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only other one that I just wanted to, I guess, put on our radar, for lack of a better term, is that there were a number of AI memos that came out from the Pentagon this week. Now, folks who follow along the Pentagon's AI journey closely will also know that there are a number of posters all across the Pentagon with Secretary Hegseth saying he wants you to Gen AI, which is an interesting choice of that. But the memos are pretty interesting in a couple of dimensions. One is they really reset or set up some clear priorities for AI in the context of warfighting, and then a second memo in the context of Advana, which is the enterprise management system. And a lot of these are actually not huge. They were rebrands and necessary advancements, but weren't huge changes. But there were some actual big wins here. Like, there was a consolidation of authorities in the CDAO that let them control and ensure data access. There were a bunch of barrier removals, with the CDAO acting as a, quote, wartime CDAO with the authority to accelerate things like ATOs. And, there was a lot of, and the breaking up of Advana into three clear platforms, one focused on finance, one focused on enterprise elements like procurement and logistics, and one focused on warfighting intelligence data. So I think all of that was good. There was also, though, explicitly a redefinition of responsible AI with an extremely broad ability to reject DEI and, air quotes, social ideology in AI models. And those pieces did seem to be particularly targeted at certain companies and approaches, including the concerns that they didn't want any usage policy constraints that would limit lawful military applications. And you've seen some of the AI companies sort of express concerns about what that means on how the Pentagon wants to partner and use their models. So overall, interesting progress with some flags and concerns to be determined.
Last thing I'll mention on something that maybe we will see in the future, and in terms of federal workforce data, is a news story that came out last week about FEMA downsizing, or at least I'll tell you what they say that they're doing, which is basically FEMA staff, because of like the kind of flexible nature and the often surge nature of the work that they do, has a lot of folks who are on multi-year contracts rather than on permanent civil service roles. So FEMA has told a number of folks who are on multi-year contracts that are set to expire this year, they will not have them renewed, even those who are working actively on existing and current recovery areas, or who might be on standby or pending support to be on the ground after disaster and help survivors. So this is like the beginnings of a story here. I am very interested to see how this plays out. I think that like the administration's messaging and shaping around their FEMA reform, it's not to say it's changed. I think that they have learned quite a bit in terms of like how FEMA operates over the last year or so. So more to follow on that as we learn more about how DHS is structuring that downsizing. With that, it is, as I said before, it is Tuesday, January 20th, which means who knows what allied country will have started attacking later in the week. But for now, we're going to focus on how to think about alliances in the context of news coming out about Greenland. And then with trends that we should look for over the long term with Mara. So we're going to switch to warning signs. And so hopefully you have almost certainly seen, but let me give you a bit quick recap. Over the past couple of weeks, the Trump administration has revived an idea that the United States should somehow take over Greenland, because for reasons that I think mostly come from our Mercator projection map, but who knows. To be very clear, though, that Greenland is an autonomous territory of Denmark and part of the broader Nato, as in allies, family. Danish and Greenlandic, is that how one says this? Greenlandic.
Sure.
Apologies to people from Greenland if it's not. Have been super clear, absolutely held to the no. Greenland is not for sale. We are not here to be taken over. But instead of backing off, the administration has basically escalated in a lot of different routes. First with military threats, and now floating the idea of using tariffs and economic pressure against Denmark and other allies to force some concessions. So we are watching, just to put a very fine point on it, we're watching how the U.S. is threatening a close ally over its own territory, using coercion that looks a lot more like how great powers treat adversaries in the height of a crisis versus how alliances are supposed to work. Mara is going to explain it all. All of us here, just like how Clarissa used to do on Nickelodeon.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Give us some context for the U.S. relationship with allies generally, in particular with NATO. Like this, we have like things have changed quite a bit since the World War II era. Where are we now in terms of how we think about alliances and alliance management?
Absolutely. So look, post-World War II, there was this effort to set up a security, economic, and political order around the world. So a number of like economic institutions were pulled together, emphasizing things like free trade and integration. Various security relationships like the NATO alliance was pulled together. Politically, there was a real emphasis on coordinating among a different, bunch of different partners. And this all led to the most prosperous and peaceful time in world history. Massive economic growth, life expectancy rising, decrease in extreme poverty, the establishment of large middle classes. To be sure, it was not butterflies and unicorns, right? There's a whole bunch of problematic stuff that happened during that time, and sort of the lifting up was not for everyone and was not everywhere. So about just over 10 years or so, I would say, it became increasingly clear that this security, economic, and political order was not as pristine as maybe we had thought, and was really starting to have a bunch of holes poked through it. You saw this as like China was building islands. You saw it through Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And then, of course, fast forward much more recently to another invasion of Ukraine. You saw efforts to not really help out those who were hurt the most by free trade and, other efforts, death, destruction, etc. So we had a pretty decent order that started crumbling. It was difficult or uncomfortable maybe to acknowledge that that was the case. So folks didn't really pull together a whole bunch of alternatives. And now we're in this anomalous time with President Trump where he doesn't really, he sees America's allies as a burden. He sees autocracies easier to deal with than democracies. He thinks the open trade system is fundamentally unfair. He thinks America can just take care of itself on its own. If there's anything America wants, like territory, resources, et cetera, it should just go get them, et cetera, et cetera. And so just like a totally different theory of the case, America is like the center of gravity in this international system. I joke that like America's the popular girl in 7th grade. Whether or not you like her, you always know what she's wearing. You always know what she's doing. And so when you have a US president who takes a different approach to all of these issues, it's like an earthquake in the international system. So that's kind of where we are right now.
I love this analogy. Okay. When God, this is such a bizarre conversation to be having, is like, what world am I in? When you look at things like Trump's rhetoric about Greenland, the tariff threats, or any other things he's been posting on Truth Social or saying, how should any of us tell the difference between just like noise, grouchiness, blah, had a bad dinner, negotiating tactics, and genuine structural change? It sounds as though like you're leaning towards like, whether we like it or not, we are in structural change moment, and we may want to think of it this differently, but glad to hear more.
100% in structural change. Look, we were on a certain trajectory, and I think President Trump has just sort of fast forwarded that trajectory. You're asking a really good question, Lauren. We can't really know what it is. Like, it's a mystery, not a secret. And I think the interesting case study here is Norway. Trump has had a pretty good relationship with the Norwegians for a couple of reasons, not least they're like incredibly wealthy. He's gotten to know some of their senior leaders really well, including one who used to be the Secretary General of NATO, who he liked a lot as well. And yet his interactions with the Norwegians, as leaked through some text messages by the Norwegian Prime Minister's office,
Sure, why not?
show that that relationship is also getting really, really complicated and complex. So there's a little bit of anything's possible. And one might be able to sort of exhale for the moment because a certain sort of challenge has turned into a blip, but that doesn't mean that it's gone away whatsoever.
Just to close out that line of questioning, and I'll turn it over to Rada. So we think it's very easy to think of like President Trump in terms of his personality, and like this is just like a Trumpism, as against this is like a durable foreign policy strategy that is like going to live on beyond the Trump personality moment. So what I'm thinking of is not just like the one-to-one, the text messaging, and so on. Our allies, both like, should they be planning around this transactional thing as a long-term strategy? And also, like, are they starting to get it that they are needing to do that sort of planning around the transactionalism?
Yes, they should be planning, and they're slowly starting to get it.
Okay.
I gave a talk this summer in Denmark, of all places, and I called it was fun while it lasted. Mm-hmm. And it was about sort of the shifting international order and where we are. It's amazing to think that that was just 6 months ago, and now there are like genuine discussions about what a war plan might look like to take over Greenland. So look, the challenge for allies, if we play out our whole like popular girl in 7th grade, when things happen, you can't help but naturally go towards the United States. You both have had this experience as well. One of the extraordinary things of being a US policymaker is whatever's going on, countries from around the world come to you and they say, hey, how do you understand what's happening? What are you thinking about doing? What do you think we should do? I mean, that is like extraordinary influence, a la the popular girl, of course. And so now allies are having to sort of slowly acknowledge that that's not quite where we are. And so look, some of them are kind of playing for time. They're doing things like flattering President Trump. Some of them are hoping, like, look, we can wait him out. Maybe there's a status quo ante. I'm quite skeptical of such a thing. Others are slowly starting to figure out, like, what might a plan B look like? Does it look like new geometries of relationships? Does it look like getting new capabilities in your arsenal? Does it look like spending less money inside the United States and working less with the United States? A whole bunch of dilemmas, but these are like really, really hard questions and they take a long time to bear fruit. So unsurprisingly, a lot of allies, and remember, America's got this unparalleled network of allies and partners. Literally no country in the history of the world has ever had something like this. And so we're sort of watching this all in real time for the first moment in history. They're trying to figure out, what is plan B when we're so used to plan A, for both better and worse?
So let me sort of pull the thread a little bit on your playing for time comment there, and maybe to extend your popular girls analogy, like, when, maybe being a little bit of devil's advocate, when is it time to say, like, the system needs to change? Like, when are we in our Heather's moment versus our, Mean Girls, right? Like, where you're just flipping who's in charge. Yeah. You're welcome, listeners.
Oh God, I want to think about that. Maybe write something on it. That's incredible.
My mind is blown. Heather's, Mean Girls, like, there's so much to be done here. Yeah, absolutely. But that's hard to do. It's unpleasant and it's not, if the status quo ante was working pretty well for you, even if it was like flawed, it's really hard to acknowledge that there's a need for a change. There's this amazing book about paradigm shifts, structure, scientific revolutions. And the author, Thomas Kuhn, talks about how, like, you've got this paradigm and then you start to, like, Frankenstein it, right? There's all these anomalies and you're like, no, it's okay. I can totally stick with this paradigm. And it's just becoming like uglier and uglier and uglier until finally you're like, you know what? Turns out this thing doesn't work anymore. I have to go to something new. And I actually wonder if, in that vein, what President Trump hasn't done is actually a little bit useful, because it's so hard for folks to acknowledge that that paradigm is flawed. It's so hard to get off what was, like, working decently, but less and less and less, with, like, diminishing, marginal returns. He's, I think, offered quite a deal of clarity with his approach.
Mara, you just, like, sent me way back to our baby special assistant days. Like, my boss at the time, when you and I were baby special assistants together, like, assigned me that book to read.
Did he really?
He did. It's part of working for him, which actually was good. But it was also just like, this is so weird.
I do not remember special assistants getting book assignments, but that's amazing.
It's good to know. Yeah, what powers you could yield.
One of the dilemmas, though, for these countries is, like, you don't have great alternatives. And you have to kind of rethink in this paradigm, what does it look like to cooperate, compete, or engage in conflict when sort of that center of gravity, whether you liked it or not, that is the United States, is no longer playing that role. So, like, one option is countries can just decide, like, we're going to hug and make up. And, maybe we have a relationship with the United States that's on slightly more equal footing. There's more burden sharing. I'm quite skeptical of that. One alternative is, like, wholly turn elsewhere, right? Go in with China's vision of world order or Russia's. I think those are, like, so fundamentally kind of orthogonal to what a lot of America's allies and partners want, that that's not really going to happen. And then the third, which is probably the most likely, is fragmentation, right? They'll figure out what are, like, the bespoke topics on which they will work with the United States. They'll try to figure out how to be more self-reliant.
If those are the plan Bs, and there is a chance of I'll call it snapback, or a, hug and make up, what are the things you're looking for in terms of point of no return for alliance degradation, the point where we know we are going to plan B and plan A is done? And kind of maybe also help us understand what that means for sort of the broader landscape here, internal European relationships, qua Europe, Asia, globally, kind of, that's take that where you will.
So this is where I think one interesting indicator we should look for is the extent to which defense and security institutions are special. So, like militaries report to civilian political masters, of course, right? And yet we know militaries are often like quite technocratic in democracies, right? They sort of like they have their plans and they walk through their plans and they do their cooperation, etc. And there's a lot of energy happening around the world with the US military, right? Across Asia, across Europe, etc., where the collaboration continues, the exercises continue, etc. So that's one area where I will look quite closely to see. Is it that, say, countries in Europe decide we don't want our military cooperating with the US military now because it's gone in to take Greenland? Or let's not even use a hypothetical. When you look at some of the things that the US military has done over the last few months in the Caribbean, at a minimum, some of that looks to be unprofessional. At a maximum, some of that looks to be perhaps not okay at all. Are there militaries who are going to say, hey, we actually don't want to cooperate with at least this part of the US military or it writ large? So I think that'll be a really interesting indicator to think about.
And maybe I'll just leave us, as I often want to do, with a bit of hope, which is, what do you think where are the sources of resilience in the system, right? Like, obviously, this is a particularly dynamic moment with many factors, but this is a system that's endured for some time. So, like, what are those sources of resilience, and where might we look for hope that stability is coming?
Institutions would probably be the closest answer I have for you, although I don't know that is filling you with butterflies and unicorns. But to some extent, a number of institutions do continue functioning, right? And so I guess the extent to which that will be the case, despite all of this noise and even signals at the most strategic level. But we're fundamentally at a real crossroads. And lives will continue. The system will function to some extent, but less and less and in more curious ways than it has before. And that is fundamentally going to shape human behavior. I mean, the United States has been pretty lucky. Like, we're obviously blessed by geography. We were able to play this singular role in the world for a number of decades. Countries like accepted us doing that. More countries wanted to be on our team than on our adversaries' team. When we fought conflicts, they were almost always away games. And that's probably not what the near to midterm is going to look like, unfortunately. I'm sorry, you asked for optimism, and I kind of gave you not that.
No, I mean, but it wasn't like end of the world is coming immediately. Yeah. It could be worse. I definitely, as you guys were talking about, the United States is the popular girl, and you can't not get away from her. I went to another 90s reference. This is terrible. I'm not committed to it, but maybe we've gone from the popular girl to the kid who was in the Pearl Jam song Jeremy that everyone kind of stared at, and then suddenly, anyway, so maybe we're not going to get to a Jeremy situation. Maybe we've just gotten to a this is really irritating and weird and bad. And
yeah, I'm worried we're in a we don't talk about Kevin situation.
Yeah,
you are familiar with that book, but that's really taken us down a dark pipeline, and so maybe we'll just hope for institutions.
Yeah, hope for institutions, you guys. Mara, this has been fabulous. No surprise, but thank you so much for joining us on a Sirens episode. I know we will have you back. Hopefully on a more positive topic, but that's not our field, so who knows.
Thank you for having me. This was such a treat.
Okay, so we are moving on to dumpster fires, things that are kind of long-standing or moving news stories are going to have a long-term impact on American and international institutions. No surprise, we're going to spend some time this week on Iran protests. There's lots of angles for us to take on this story, but so we will start with this one and then probably return to this over the coming weeks, depending on where the story goes. So just to catch listeners up, and again, this is on Tuesday, over the past 2 weeks, Iran has seen a pretty significant resurgence in widespread protests, with the latest demonstrations began in response to some escalating enforcement of the mandatory hijab laws and have expanded into broader grievances about economic hardship, government corruption, political repression, And what makes this moment particularly significant is the timing. Iran's regime is they're dealing with a lot. They've got multiple simultaneous pressures, including weakened regional position after losses in Syria, as well as Lebanon over the past several years. They have an ongoing economic crisis from sanctions. And of course, the legitimacy, try this saying that 3 times fast, crisis at home. The protests also come as the Trump administration has come back into power with a lot more hawkish Iran policy, possibly, we think, maybe, who knows, and a different strategy towards the regime. It's funny, as I was introducing this, I thought like, oh, well, they just came into office. No, it's been a year. Wow. So let's start with what's actually happening on the ground in Iran right now. And how is that different from other protest waves that we have seen over the past decade plus? And what's the regional and strategic context that makes this moment different? And what is the angle from the U.S. perspective? So, Radha, why don't you just give us first domestic context, what's different there, and particularly the violences make this different, and then also stepping back on a national security context overall for the regime?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing that makes this different is the scale and unprecedented violence. So the current protests have spread across all of the provinces much faster than previous uprisings, and the death toll estimates are potentially over 12,000, far exceeding the 1,500 killed in 2019, the sort of bloody November, or casualties in the 2022's Amini protests. So we're talking about potentially thousands killed in individual protests, and the word massacre being used not infrequently. Paired with that is this complete communications blackout. So since January 8th, Iran has imposed a near total internet and international phone blackout, far more comprehensive than 2019's 5-day shutdown, and is not surgical. It's a much broader prevention of information, which is clearly signals the regime views any imagery and or communications about what's happening on the ground as an existential threat. And the last piece is just to note that not that the economy was great before, but it fell about 30% in the first week of January, with inflation like 50 to 70% in some categories like food, highly stagnant growth, and terrible water conditions. So the combination of the day-to-day, I mean, you think affordability resonates here, try 70% inflation on top of these sort of broader protests has really set the stage for widespread mobilization and really harsh regime crackdown. And just noting to add, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, so with that, all of that context suggests to me a regime that, despite its harsh crackdown, is not feeling terribly confident in itself at the moment. So can you expand, just based on the overall things that have been happening in terms of around Iran's overall power, regime's overall power, and how it, particularly from a national security perspective, how are they feeling in this moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of this is, there were these nuclear program setbacks with, enrichment continuing, but a number of facilities degraded, and the efforts to think about how they might dissuade a U.S. military intervention, but no real plan to resurrect the nuclear threat that they once had. There is this, at the same time, a succession crisis that is looming, with the supreme leader being 86 and reportedly in poor health. And this kind of weird pairing between hardliners and reformists all backing violent crackdown, kind of recognizing that the overall regime, whether you're a reformist or a hardliner, they view this regime now as in its existential death throes, and they're unifying along the lines of violent restraint and protests. And so that, I think, that poor national security options combined with ailing leader has resulted in a really dangerous mix of activities.
So all of this has prompted a lot of reaction, both from the United States, but also from a lot of regional players. We have the president, at least probably most consistently, threatening military action in terms of violence against protesters, which is, let's just talk about irony for a moment. We have the Gulf states, Turkey and Qatar, quietly back channeling to hopefully prevent intervention. And I don't think this is out of like their love for the Iranian regime, but mostly like just thinking about regional instability. What is an actually responsible approach in your mind? Because like to your point, like this is not the same kind of situation we've been down before, but it has similarities. And are there any sort of, I would say, call them catastrophic mistakes that we should be trying to avoid at this moment?
Yeah, and I think you'll have some of this context too, Lauren, given sort of past, but maybe just to set the stage for a second, the current U.S. posture, Trump obviously has made lots of threats on being locked and loaded and ready to engage, but to date has not yet done anything. As per usual, we have about 30,000 U.S. troops deployed across Central Command, so across the sort of Middle East region, but we don't have any carrier strike groups currently in the CENTCOM region. And that's a big difference compared to, say, 2025. So when we struck Iran's nuclear program in 25.
Thought about that. I mean,
yeah,
I guess I had read it, but like that is a very just mind-bogglingly different posture than what we have been, frankly, over the last 2 decades.
Right. So there is a ship that was ordered, ironically, from the South China Seas to the Middle East, which tells you everything you want to know about the pivot to Asia. We're spread Atlantic and Pacific and now Middle East with activity, obviously, in Venezuela and the Southern Atlantic, activity and maintenance in the Pacific. And then, that is something to keep in mind. And then there are some signals here that, something might happen with the withdrawal of non-essential personnel from Al Udeid and the Fifth Fleet Base in Bahrain. So I think, word on the street, and by the street, I mean largely the newspapers, was that Trump was presented with some multiple strike packages in mid-January. And there was an expectation that he might do it, but was potentially restrained based on a call from Netanyahu, along with a number of the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, and Egypt, based on concerns to risk to U.S. facilities. So we kind of got U.S. with options, a really different force posture than we have before. And also there's this kind of like, how much should the U.S. is the U.S. intervening actually undermine the protests themselves, which right now are organic and clearly not U.S. backed. And also, how much do we want to buy into the future problems of Iran by intervening now? So I think that's where we are. And we obviously have lessons that didn't work, like Somalia and, like Libya in 2011, that we probably don't want to recreate.
Yeah, I am like, as you're talking through this, I'm very much experiencing Libya deja vu around the early 2011, wanting to do things to prevent violence against protesters and rebels, not having a ton of options to be able to give the president, at least that are like more urgent and time sensitive, and also recognizing exactly as you said, anything that would be done would be like putting the U.S. finger on a scale in a very open and deliberate way, which at the time during the Arab Spring, the U.S. was fully out there on that scale. The other thing that, as you're mentioning, as occurs to me is like all of this is effectively all this is going on at the same time as Venezuela and this Greenland decision that we'll talk about in a little while. So this is effectively voluntary. Like, can you imagine the situation room context over the past couple of weeks of having to walk through Greenland, Venezuela, Iran options, all of the above, all because the president sought it, not because it was forced upon us in any way.
A lot of the conversation about Trump foreign policy is that he's anti-interventionist, and I'm not entirely sure he is. I think he has a very particular theory of intervention. And so that's, I think, the question on like what an intervention in Iran would look like. If you look at Venezuela, other than the president apparently being the acting president, President Trump being the acting president of Venezuela, according to Wikipedia. But otherwise, he removed the leader and then wants to use some combination of coercion and incentives to drive in changes in that country. Now it's very early days, or the early days in Afghanistan, where you think about the toppling of the Taliban. If you stop there, Afghanistan looks really successful. Now, then you have 2 decades of war on trying to stabilize, and it really obviously does not. So I think there's this kind of open question on what does an Iranian engagement in this administration's mind look like? Is it a quick shock and awe and then you're out and over to the Iranians to sort out the mess, or is there something else?
Yeah, and in all of these examples, positive and negative that we're talking about, there was a very significant congressional engagement ahead of time, and not just in like, we notified you, but in a active lobbying by Congress about go do something, go do something, go do something. Definitely true in Somalia. The impact of several congressional caucuses had a lot of the influence on like overall U.S. intervention here. Same thing with Libya, as much as Congress didn't want to admit that. Afghanistan, yes. Iraq, kind of a bizarre example, but like all of these had some significant congressional engagement in some way. And with Iran, it's been oddly quiet, like not from everybody, but like there's like from left and right, it has not been the debate and dialogue has not been as such a one. Maybe it's because everybody's frankly overwhelmed by everything else that's going on. Just to kind of close this out though, like let's take ourselves back to when we were in government and talking about these sorts of options. What would actually be valuable right now to think about in terms of shaping the president's proposals and options that he can consider?
So I think actually what's unique now is a core element that is threatening to the regime is information access. So focusing on how you could get that back with your buddy Elon Musk or other, providers. I think being able to document abuses and coordinate responses is going to be extremely helpful. And that's actually something this administration does have leverage on. The other pieces that I think would be responsible, and I just don't know where we are, and we'll talk more about sort of allies later, is like, can we have a coalition to coordinate pressure on the regime? Can we kind of think about how to enable democratic action for Iranians? And these are all things that would require either institution we've disbanded, like Voice of America and USAID, or alliances that are under threat, like NATO. So it's what the normal set of policy options are like here just look very different.
Yeah, I very vividly remember when all of the Persian language service stuff was canceled at Voice of America and the overall programs there. And then like them immediately saying, we're going to do all of this stuff in this region. Like, but you just fired them. Like, that's not how the system works. Like you have them, right? Like they're not contractors you bring back and forth. They're just up there.
Right.
Oh, well, let that, I'm certain we will come back to this. So we're going to transition now, and don't turn off the show, to the Government Accountability Office.
Well, Lauren, you probably know that Gene Dodaro has concluded his 15-year term at GAO as a comptroller general.
Oh, I do.
And this is important because GAO is actually one of the last institutional referees in a system that's increasingly anti-rule. So the next comptroller general is actually going to play a big role on what the future of oversight looks like in the government, how GAO can, frankly, provide oversight, and what kind of challenges the administration might offer in response, and what the relevance of organizations like GAO might be, especially for a Congress that's approach to oversight itself looks very different. So maybe let's just start off by helping the listeners understand, what does GAO actually do?
Okay, so first let me say, I know this doesn't sound like the sexiest topic, but it is super important, exactly as Radha said. Like the GAO plays a bunch of different roles that, whether we like it or not, we rely on. And many of them, like no other institution either does or also can do, based on like their role in the ecosystem, because they're a legislative institution that has oversight and connectivity to the executive branch. So a couple of big things that it does that are important. Like one, that is that both Congress and executive branch are like, okay, fine, I need you most of the time. Is that they are a procedural referee between branches when they disagree about like what is the right way to follow procedure. And examples of this are impoundment disputes, like when administrations either delay or withhold congressionally appropriated funds. GAO is often the entity to say, like, that is not okay. Courts are very slow about this. They can be political. OMB can't do it. GAO is the one supposed to step in and say that and give Congress leverage around, like, that is not okay. We are giving you the official rule. This is not okay. Please jump in here. But it only works if the executive branch is willing to engage, and also if Congress is willing to follow up. Another example is around the Congressional Review Act. GAO they will decide if an agency action actually counts as a rule for CRA purposes, because that determination decides whether Congress can then trigger the CRA process to let them undo rules. Those sound super nerdy. Let me tell you how much the lawyers spend so much time on these things, or at least they should. Their act is really important capacity for Congress. And we have talked a bit about this on the show before, how congressional committee staffs and personal staffs are just frankly far too small for fit for purpose. GAO can be a source of analysis and expertise over the long term that congressional staffers really rely on in order to help understand how have things performed in the past and what do they need to know for the future. Because so much of their work is directed by what congressional priorities. They can be a bit of what I would call an early warning system by using cross-government audits and their long-term tracking. You probably have heard of, or maybe you've heard of, the high-risk list, which is this big list they put out around, here's a big picture cross-cutting things that are putting government execution in danger. So things like HR and IT are on there. And then last but not least, they are, of course, the part of institutional accountability. They follow up on their own recommendations over time and report back to Congress. They do all this in addition to the work that you probably traditionally associate for them around like audits and waste, fraud, and abuse and spreadsheets and things like this. So they have the role has widened over time, and they play a more independent role than inspectors generals or think tanks or courts can do because they have that long-term institutional history.
So, I mean, maybe for folks who are trying to understand, obviously what GAO provides an oversight function, but that's really different than what OMB, the courts, and think tanks are doing.
Yep. Yeah. So like GAO, like IGs are part of an agency. They know the agency really well, but they are part of the executive branch and their auspices are just that agency. OMB can play a quasi oversight role, but they have like that institutional imperative with the president. Courts are there to decide, is this legal or not? And those are the process and they're somewhat politicized. Think tanks don't get all the access, whereas GAO shows up at your door and you're supposed to respond. Like, okay, like not quite in a we have subpoenaed you sort of way, but in terms of what is it, being able to be responsive to GAO basically is part of being able to be responsive to Congress. It's not dissimilar from a congressional committee saying, we want you to come and brief us in some ways.
Okay, so maybe I'll call that sort of the promise of GAO. Let's talk for a minute about the reality of GAO, which is it is this entity that has the potential to do independent, systematic analysis, but it has to do that with the administration and Congress. So what are the implications of that sort of cross-dependency on the reality of what GAO can do?
Yeah, it's a great question. So like every administration lightly pushes back on GAO findings and also GAO access, because sometimes they are frankly not very well set up to be able to drive what makes sense for them. And they don't always go in with like the best breadth of understanding. And sometimes their recommendations just seem to be a bit off. This administration has formalized that pushback in a pretty decisive way. For example, OMB updated what is called Circular A11. And if you know what that is, you are a true nerd. To explicitly minimize GAO's role in executive branch guidance, stressing that agencies should follow OMB and DOJ and OLC interpretations, not GAO opinions. And that's a big deal. That comes getting back to like that referee piece. Russ Vogts, who is the head of OMB, has in the past said that GAO shouldn't exist as a quasi-legislative entity and that GAO opinions are non-binding in his view. That's compared to prior administrations that have pretty close working relationships between the head of OMB and the head of GAO, that's a big deal. And that changes how they work, because if they don't have enforcement power, and if they don't have access and they don't have buy-in, they have to lean a lot harder on Congress to actually use their findings. Much of the time, agencies are at least somewhat open to trying to implement their findings that they offer, usually about 75% of the time. But agencies they're kind of freaked about engaging with GAO, given the messaging that they're getting from the top on the career side. And Congress, as we know, is maybe not following up as much as they should. So as a result, you have this oversight puzzle where GAO, in theory, should be this great arm to be able to look into how well are things working. Agencies are scared to engage with them. Congress is kind of engaging sometimes, but not always, and not really using their oversight functions as is typical to more politicized. So it's really weakened the institution and the impact.
Yeah, I mean, I'm struck by this conversation on GAO, because it feels like a very extreme impact of this declining kind of adoption of Title I oversight from Congress, and sort of as distinct from the executive branch, and all of the tools that are in place that enable Congress to really lean in and push on the administration, like the GAO, which can audit and then provide its findings to Congress, and Congress can use in its oversight. As those get weaker, the ability of Congress to kind of regain that oversight function degrades, and then there's less incentive to use it, and that's the kind of vicious cycle you don't want if you believe in like separation of powers. So, if we're thinking about what we need to do to change this, to get back to the kind of impact we want from GAO, to get the kind of return on investment from this organization, what are things that GAO should be doing, that we should be doing, that we should look to push Congress to do? Like, what's in the realm of action here?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it doesn't get a ton of attention because GAO is sort of like a sub rosa agency, but particularly with this transition moment, it's a good thing to pay attention to. So first, GAO puts out like a lot of stuff. And I think that it would do well, Congress would do well, and agencies would do well to think about what actually drives change here and where can GAO be most valuable. I'm one of the big nerds, so that when GAO came knocking and said like, hey, we want to do an audit or an intervention on your program, I would be like, awesome, I can use this as a way to help get things done by highlighting things I needed Congress to care about. So the GAO needs to like reflect on the fact that a lot of their impact, a lot of how they judge their impact is the uptake of their recommendations. So that is somewhat flawed because, first of all, a lot of those recommendations remain open for years, particularly those that are on the high risk list. Secondly, it should look more in terms of like what kinds of outcomes it's bringing about rather than recommendation adoption. It's very easy to check the box on like, yeah, we adopted this new process, as opposed to, yes, this resulted in lower housing costs. That's harder to measure. But GAO would be well served by thinking about what is the output the outcome results that they're trying to audit for, rather than did you do this one specific very processy oriented thing. Because GAO really shapes a lot of the oversight narratives, right? The other thing that I think about in this, I'll put it this way, GAO doesn't really shape executive behavior as much in this administration. It has more potential to shape oversight narratives, so they should both think about that as a, like, if that's our superpower, how are we operationalizing that? But then also reflect on the fact that like oversight becomes a tool of like a problem is known as opposed to that problem is being fixed, which is valuable, but it's not probably the goal that really want to invest in. So like that kind of gets back to like, what is our first principles for GAO? Do we want it to actually solve problems or just help know problems? And how does the executive branch and legislative branch rely on that? Some of the other things I think to think about is that the ways that they do their work tend to be pretty long. This is true of all oversight. Like over audit timelines with their IGs, the Hill, GAO, it's like a 6-month, year-long, year-and-a-half long other kind of process where you could, if you wanted to, be a bit more iterative and more agile in terms of how you're doing this and do problem solving in real time instead of wait till like the very end to be like, hey, by the way, that failed. Like, oh, thanks, that was really useful. They're like the pandemic. Oh God, what does PRAC stand for? The pandemic IG that was set up. They came up with some really awesome models of agile oversight. They also they have this history of doing results-oriented audits that they could draw on to like the outcomes point before, as opposed to just doing, have you followed rules or process? And then the last thing I think that they could do is like work to better define their prioritization. Right now, Congress can give them a big to-do list. They can set their own to-do list. If you actually try to focus GAO's work, like what is the biggest ROI areas, or like what are some of the high leverage audits we can do that are tied to big decision points and big risks, that could be more valuable than like, let's do all of the things. So that's like, it's a whole lot of things for them to consider, but like, this is a great moment for them to think about it.
Yeah. And I mean, I think maybe closing out this section, there's obviously a leadership transition, and that's a big opportunity. What do you think they should think? What do you think people should think about as we're looking at that?
So what's amazing on this, just and brought us at the beginning, CGs, comptroller generals, they have 15-year terms. That's a long time in government. It is the way that you select them is fascinating. Like what is supposed to happen is that a commission of Senate and House leaders should put forward at least 3 possible options to the president for him to pick from and nominate, and then the Senate confirms. And that in the past has often taken a long time and had been a contentious process. If I was queen for a day or a president for a day, I would use this as the opportunity to really have a conversation about what we want GAO to do and engage with candidates around these questions around reform, and use this as a moment where we're both kind of like resetting behaviors on both the Hill and executive branch side, but also bringing in a leader who is bought in on that. And don't wait too long. Like, this is not something where delay is going to suddenly make the conversation better.
Well, I'm sure that there will be exciting times ahead for GAO as we look at that.
All right, so to close out for Gong Show this week, we are going deep into the Radaverse of Jane Austen, and I would like to pull the thread on one or two things that, but just thinking about like the kinds of like activities or behaviors that you see in Jane Austen novels. Are there any that you find to be particularly baffling, or are there any that you just like really, really love?
Okay. So the two things I have are related. So the thing I love, so much of the activity is concentrated in these seasons where people are on the marriage market. Yep. There are like the eligible ladies, the new ingenues, the women who have been around for a couple of seasons. And the goal at the end of the season is to make your best match. And that allows this concentrated set of activities and interactions across lots of different pairings that is both fodder in like Austen-verse for all sorts of fun activities, and was the reality of people coming from the time where they would come in from the country, they would have London houses, that would have their seasons, they would try to make matches. And it's such a fascinating way to really just compress this activity into it. But the thing that I find baffling is just why? Like, why did they do this to themselves? There was a whole year and they concentrated this into a set number of weeks, and that created these like artificial pressure and timelines for like what they themselves would decide are the most important decisions for these families, these most powerful families in the country to make. And they were like, you know what? We could take 52 weeks, but we're going to take 6 and then vaguely complain about what happened in those 6 weeks for the rest of the year. Anyway, I find this baffling, and I think, hey, in retrospect, maybe just spread it out, give yourself a little wiggle room. I don't know. Yeah.
And you didn't even have like Facebook in order to preview everybody.
This is what I'm saying.
So for me, they are the baffling one that I'm going to pick is this didn't occur in every book, but it occurred in many. Like the going on long walks as an activity. Because it wasn't hiking. It was just like, we're going to walk like 6 miles, just like as our activity for the weekend as a group. And we're like, what? That doesn't seem wise. Like, just based on what I know of like all of y'all's overall like dress, like how you're dressed right now, your overall fitness questions, things like that, which is why you always end up with something terrible happening in the midst of these long walks. And it's very odd. The corollary to this that I actually really like and wish we could figure out a way to bring into regular life is like calling hours and days where
I agree.
Home.
Totally agree.
And like, oh, we're going to, Rada is at home on Tuesday afternoons. We're going to go see Rada, or like, we're going calling. We have our like all of our things together. And you really start to realize how much of like daily life was structured on the fact that women didn't have jobs. And actually a lot of men didn't have jobs either. And therefore, like, what are you going to do with your day and your time? So fascinating altogether. I'm sure there's many, many PhD theses getting written on the topic. All right. With that, thank you. It has been another delightful episode of Sirens. We'll see you next time.